Well, to start off, we'll let you know a little bit about it.
You want to know about games?
Welcome to Retroware TV. Whether it be Hironobu Sakaguchi, Yu Suzuki, Tomonobu Itagaki, Yuji Horii, or Shigeru Miyamoto, video game players the world over anticipate the newest offerings from the masters of video game direction and writing. Over the last 15 years, one predominant talent in the art of game creation has arguably captured the imagination of gamers while evolving the craft and style of games more so than any other individual. That man is Hideo Kojima. With the release of Metal Gear Solid for the PlayStation in 1998, Kojima and the Metal Gear series that launched his career in the 1980s quickly became the gold standard for creativity and cinematic storytelling in modern video gaming. With a flair for melodrama and the intelligent incorporation of political and pop science themes, Hideo Kojima has aptly fabricated fictional environments and characters that summarily envelop gamers, creating a bankable formula for his own Kojima Productions Group and its partner publisher Konami. Of all the creative talent that Kojima has brought to the gaming industry, his original love and goal was to be a filmmaker, a dream that many game creators had sought prior to landing in an industry that would one day surpass movies as the primary art form of the masses. In 1988 with Snatcher, Hideo Kojima used video games as a medium to deliver a linear narrative while building upon point-and-click adventure game logic for the purpose of fashioning a memorable cyberpunk tale. With its release on the Sega CD, English-speaking audiences were able to enjoy this title, one of Kojima's first and most revered games. On July 29, 1994, Kojima refined the cinematic stylings of Snatcher by releasing another anime-inspired digital comic book. In Japan only, Konami published Policenauts for the popular NEC PC 9821 computer. From the release of Policenauts' first trailer, gamers knew they were in store for what was boasted as the next generation of Snatcher. With full-motion anime sequences and revolutionary CGI animations, Kojima crafted something that looked more like a film than a video game. Japanese television commercials for the PlayStation and Sega Saturn amplified this theme as the drama surrounding the characters and the plot were given the spotlight over the gameplay features. Even one Saturn ad used an opening background image quite similar to the thematic teasers used in 2009 to create interest in Kojima's newest Metal Gear Solid announcement. Policenauts is exemplified by its classic detective storyline, framed by unique and grandiose themes that challenge mankind's preconceived notions of manifest destiny by questioning our limitations as a people yearning to extend into the final frontier. The questions raised by Policenauts are large and thought-provoking. Are human beings capable of extended space travel and space colonization in a biological, psychological, and moral context? How do these limitations affect our exploratory nature? How will these limitations breed new evils and new corruptions? With mankind celebrating the 40th anniversary of walking on the moon and the future of space travel evolving from shuttles and rovers to Mars and space stations, the questions posed by Hideo Kojima's narrative are more relevant than ever before. with the inspired work of Marc Laidlaw, Artemio Urbina, Michael Sawyer, and the entire Policenauts translation project at policenauts.net. As of August 23, 2009, Hideo Kojima's 46th birthday, the full English translation patch for the PlayStation was released to the masses. For weeks prior to the release, Retroware TV was invited to be part of the exclusive beta testing team. Sworn to secrecy, we went to work playing the game, searching for bugs, and experiencing the grandeur of this story. For 15 years, I can say that this game has been the singular gaming holy grail I've waited to experience. And I can say without a doubt that when I completed this game during its early beta stage, it was official. Policenauts was not only everything I had hoped for, but it had surpassed Snatcher in the realm of storyline and presentation. Policenauts is a remarkable game. It holds up with some of the greatest science fiction narratives. The basic plot revolves around the protagonist, Jonathan Ingram, one of the original 5 Policenauts, police-trained astronauts, who had all been integral players in mankind's completion of the first fully realized space colony, named Beyond Coast. During a routine spacewalk and testing of a new EVA spacesuit called the Yuri EMPS prototype, a malfunction sends Jonathan out into space as his 4 counterparts have no choice but to look on. With quick thinking, Ingram is able to activate the cold sleep device in the survival ball attached to his suit, preserving him in a state of suspended animation until he is discovered 25 years later, in the year 2038. It has now been almost 3 years, and Jonathan Ingram has settled in as a private detective in what is now Old Los Angeles. Focusing his efforts on a recent surge of missing children, Jonathan Ingram is visited by his estranged wife. Having not seen her since his disappearance 28 years earlier, she arrives looking to hire him to find her missing husband, Kenzo Hojo. Jonathan, torn by the shock of seeing his lost love all these years later, along with the events about to play out that lead to her sudden death, Jonathan chooses to take on the investigation on the now fully realized and fully populated Beyond Coast space colony. After the tragedy 28 years earlier and having spent the last 3 years on Earth, also known simply as home, Jonathan Ingram heads back out to space to piece together the mystery of Kenzo Hojo's disappearance and the murder of his ex-wife, with the only pieces of evidence being a set of capsules, a broken leaf, and the word Play-Doh. Jonathan sets off on his investigation. As Kojima incorporated the influences of Blade Runner, Akira, and Terminator in the creation of Snatcher, he chose a somewhat unorthodox thematic counterpart to help deliver the story of Policenauts. Once Jonathan arrives on Beyond, he meets up with one of his old LAPD partners and fellow Policenaut, Ed Brown, now relegated to a desk in the Beyond Coast Police Vice Unit. Together they make up a Riggs and Murtaugh in space. The buddy cop movie vibe plays heavy in their relationship, and when matched with some of the soundtrack's jazzier segues, the game has a Lethal Weapon kind of feel. But in general, the game only pays homage to the film series, as the game's serious theme and intricate corporate intrigue involving the omnipresent Tokugawa Group and its involvement with all aspects of Beyond Coast only exemplifies Policenauts' complex motif. Much of the production staff on Policenauts carried over from the production of Snatcher, including character design by Tomiharu Kinoshita, with mech designs by Hajime Katoki, known for his work on Gundam 0083. The heavy anime stylings of Policenauts was accomplished by multiple names in the animation business in Japan, including AIC, a prolific anime production company that is responsible for work in the titles like Vampire Princess Miyu, Tenchi Muyo, Bubblegum Crisis, and even some animation assistance in the 1980s Inspector Gadget series. Even some script work was done by Mitsuo Matsuki, who worked the previous year on New Dominion Tank Police, and animation director Akio Kawamura, who had directed on multiple anime projects such as episodes of Bleach and Full Metal Panic. The soundtrack was composed by Moroaki Furukawa and Tappy Iwase of Konami's in-house music group, Kukiya Club, as well as Ika-chan, Masahiro Ikariko, who also contributed to Kojima's Snatcher game. Furukawa has worked on various Konami games, including the original Metal Gear, Super Contra, as well as Sunset Riders. Kojima, being such a fan of the music of the game, including the game's recognizable opening musical cue, decided to use that memorable riff in the opening logo sequence for the release of the first Metal Gear Solid game. The Policenauts soundtrack has been released on multiple compilations, including the original soundtrack for the PC-98 release, featuring the 38 tracks from that version of the game. Policenauts FN contains arranged versions of certain tracks by Motoaki Furukawa and Koichi Namiki. The MIDI version included the MIDI arranged music as well as a floppy disk containing original MIDI versions of some of the tracks. The last released version was a Hideo Kojima black disc of both music selections from Snatcher as well as Policenauts. As for the releases of the game Policenauts itself, the first system to receive the game was the Japanese-only NEC PC-9821 on July 29, 1994. A CD-ROM and floppy disk were included as the system rendered all cinematic cutscenes in real time. In April of 1995, the Policenauts pilot disc was released for the 3DO, which included a demo of the game, making of featurettes, as well as some game backstory and other development information. This helped to promote the eventual 3DO release on September 29, 1995. A version with just the game was released as well as a special set that included a pack-in 3DO mouse peripheral as well as a Policenauts branded mousepad. The 3DO varied greatly from the original PC-98 version, as all animated cutscenes were rendered in 24 frames per second quality, and the beautiful 3D CG animated scenes were also added. The PlayStation version was released on January 19, 1996. The elements that made up the 3DO version were kept, except some corrections and modifications were made to the cinema's 3D elements, as well as some redrawn graphics and compression changes to lessen the pixelated look of the 3DO version. The PlayStation mouse was also usable for this release and is highly recommended. The Sega Saturn was the last console to receive the game on September 13, 1996. The Saturn version allowed for use of a mouse as well as the Saturn Virtua Gun for the shooting segments. The game was released as a special edition, along with the game-only release. Some of the featurettes and content from the 3DO pilot disc are actually hidden within the Saturn version of the game. A few weeks after the initial PlayStation release, Konami released the Policenauts Private Collection, which incorporated some of the content from the pilot disc. This content included making-of sequences, behind-the-scenes look at the CG animation, interviews, as well as a look at all of the voice actors. The Private Collection was released a full 6 years prior to Kojima's comparable The Document of Metal Gear Solid 2. The PlayStation also received the Best Series version of the game, as well as the PS1 Books Series edition, to help promote the newly designed PS1 and the LCD monitor add-on feature. The final release of this game was on the PlayStation Store in Japan in 2008, making it downloadable for the PS3 as well as the PSP. In spring 1996, Sega announced the release of Policenauts for the North American Sega Saturn. An artistic mock-up of the cover art was also released as part of a promotional pack-in that came with certain video game releases, as well as video game store flyers. The North American version of the game, however, was never released or even created, as Hideo Kojima later indicated that programmers had difficulty matching the newly translated English-synced dialogue to the full-motion video cutscenes. It is unclear how far along the newly translated voice acting had gone, but it would seem doubtful that Konami could match the 21 voice actors used in the original Japanese production. Thanks to the translated patch now available, anyone who has a copy of the PlayStation game has the ability to rip the ISO image file, apply the patch, and reburn the game. They can now play it on a modded PlayStation 1 or on the ePSXe emulator for the PC. Retroware TV recommends using Taiyo Yuden or verbatim brand CDRs and burning at no faster than 3 times speed. This will ensure the deepest ink impression to allow the somewhat finicky PlayStation laser to read the game properly. For more instruction, please head over to policenauts.net or even search YouTube for how-to videos in order to help you with the patching process. In the long history of adventure video games, the play mechanics have been evolved, altered, and reinvented again and again. Text-based adventure games preceded point-and-click, and the elements of role-playing were added and built upon to create new genres and unique methods of telling a story in the video game medium. Hideo Kojima is a storyteller who creates his stories much as a filmmaker would. The elements of action, mystery, and investigation are the hallmarks of his work. Using the point-and-click elements developed over the years, Kojima, with Snatcher and Policenauts, progressed his interactive cinema genre into something that was both unique and innovative to the video game medium. Policenauts would be his last straight interactive cinema game. It is obvious that Policenauts was a story close to Kojima's heart. Policenauts posters could be seen in Metal Gear Solid, as well as an entire anime sequence lifted from the game. The series references to Tokugawa Industries, the use of artificial blood and skin discoloration, as well as discussion of Foxhound and the character Meryl were all borrowed first from Policenauts and used in the Metal Gear Solid series. Even Metal Gear Acid for the Sony PSP featured playing cards showing some main figures from the Policenauts game. It was such a loved project that not only did the game's characters and stories make appearances and elements and references within future Kojima games, but the story setting itself was the very groundwork of a fantastical dream held by Kojima for his own personal life. During an interview with Hideo Kojima in the Japanese retro gaming program Game Center CX, he gave some insight into how the story behind Policenauts was an occupational dream he held close to his heart.
僕はその小説家になりたかったりですね、映画監督になりたかったんですけども、なかなかそんな美味しい仕事はなくてですね、どうしようかなと悶々としてた。これはもしかしたら映画に変わるメディアじゃないかなっていうふうに。でそこからですねゲームを今までは遊び手として接してましたけども、ゲームクリエイターになりたいぞとかそんなのは全くなくて、僕は宇宙飛行士になりたいぞとか
そっちの方がやったんですか。
ロス死刑の殺人家になりたいとかねそんなことを思ってた。
殺人家限定ですか。
限定ですね。もうロス死刑じゃないとダメなんですよ。
ロスでニューヨーク
うちのかみさんがみたいな
コロンボの方ですか。
それかなり影響を受けてるんです。
We have looked at the history and background of this interactive and classic game, but what about gameplay and the experience of using the interface? To begin, Policenauts is definitely not a game for everyone. The game is a linear and most often a passive experience. To many gamers, this could be considered slow and boring. For those willing to accept a different kind of game, the story and depth of the gaming environment will not disappoint. Policenauts is less of a video game and more of a new way of watching a movie. Right from the introduction, where a female voice welcomes you to the game, she presents the game as a show that should be viewed and enjoyed. Policenauts is the perfect blend of a novel and a film. The enjoyment of watching a well-crafted story with appealing visuals is mixed with the detail and involvement that one experiences only when reading a good book. It's like experiencing a great novel and watching its film adaptation all at the same time. But along with these elements, there are sporadic action sequences and puzzles to divide the narrative's flow. The game has a prologue, an epilogue, and 7 main acts. The first few acts are quite extensive, as later acts move faster and include singular scenes and scenarios that propel the storyline to its climax and the main story revelations. Just as the Policenauts trailer boasts, this is truly the next generation of Snatcher. Thanks to the added capabilities of the PlayStation when compared to the Sega CD, the menu interface has been improved and become more tactile and open-ended than the simple text menus that limit the interactivity in Snatcher. In essence, you can never interact with the visuals of Snatcher other than the simple 9-box grid of the shooting scenes within the game. But with Policenauts, all interactions begin by simply moving the arrow cursor over objects in the playfield, allowing you, Jonathan Ingram, the ability to look, talk, move, and interact. Progressing through the story involves advancing through the various conversation and investigation trees within the interactive menus. This also involves clicking on the proper areas of the screen and investigating objects that are relevant to the storyline. In 1994, when Policenauts was first released, the internet was still a new medium, and while it is hard to think of a time before high-speed access and wireless hotspots, the mid-90s was a time when everything was dial-up and the overall visual and interactive language of web surfing was still being developed. Because of this, the point-and-click logic may seem somewhat antiquated and limited. There are no hotspots on screen or indications of which conversations have been wrapped up, allowing the player to move forward in the selections. Current adventure games like Phoenix Wright have advanced the adventure genre by providing check marks next to conversations that have been completed, as well as allowing you to quickly advance through the conversations that have already been read. Policenauts requires the player to often go back to the same topics over and over again in order to learn new information. For players interested in moving forward quickly and avoiding rereading, this can occasionally become tedious. But the story is clear and the plot is engaging, so knowing what to discuss and investigate next is relatively apparent to players who are paying close attention. That being said, paying attention in Policenauts is not a problem. The story is engaging, and much like Snatcher, those who take the time to fully explore, investigate all areas, and have all conversations will be rewarded with a rich environment that, unlike a movie, you can really feel a part of. Also, much like Snatcher, Hideo Kojima has provided the player some nefarious and perverted abilities. Jonathan Ingram is able to be as much of a dog as you want him to be, even if it is only limited to repeatedly being able to touch almost every female character's breasts and make lewd comments about their appearances. There is no doubt that thanks to Policenauts.net, the translation has stayed true to the same intentions while maintaining the same innuendos of the Japanese version. Between subject matter, violence, sexuality, and coarse language, nothing is left off the table or overly westernized by censorship. Marc Laidlaw and the rest of the translation project have done so well that the localization is in no way forced or awkward. The cadence, vernacular, and intention of the language is fluid and just about as perfect as can be expected. You will never think that you're experiencing a fan translation. I can't imagine a translation being any more official than this one already is. One of the only comments I have is that because of the limitations of a fan translation, we are not able to hear the voice in English. But really, because of the superb Japanese voice acting, it's actually better to hear the original vocal inflections when mixed with the English subtitles. One criticism I have is that when reading dialogue on screen, we are simply given a box to the left of the text indicating the character's name. When reading quickly, it is easy to mix up who is speaking in certain moments. Konami could have added small character icons which would have made it easier to keep track of the conversation. But this limitation is still very small and not detrimental to the gameplay. Along with the investigations and conversations, the game is mixed with action sequences and small strategic elements that add to the interactivity. There are puzzles and even a tense and intricate bomb diffusion sequence that requires some review and concentration. The most action-oriented events involve the shooting scenes. Just as Snatcher added a shooting range in the Junker headquarters building, the Beyond Coast Police Department also had its own, more involved and complex shooting range. There are shooting challenges and opportunities to even take on Meryl, Dave, and other characters from the game, depending on the success of your shooting abilities. This is good practice for future battles throughout the game. Unlike Snatcher and its simple grid mechanism during shooting segments, in Policenauts you have full range on screen to move your red aiming reticle. Because the PlayStation version of the game does not allow for light gun support, using the control pad allows you to lock over targets, considering the D-pad is the only control you can use. You must reload your weapon as well. For Policenauts, I cannot emphasize enough the value of investing in the PlayStation mouse. Not only does it simplify the point-and-click interface, but it allows for an infinitely more accurate shooting ability. My only advice is to use the control pad during some more elaborate puzzle-solving moments, where the loose movement of the mouse cursor can affect your outcome. All in all, using the mouse is actually very responsive and natural, and after all the years of using Macs and PCs, the simple one-button point-and-click style of gameplay becomes very easy to understand. When playing with a mouse, Policenauts becomes a game you can play with one hand and one button. Thanks to a control option menu and an auto-save feature, Policenauts can truly be an enjoyable, if albeit passive, gameplay experience. My biggest fear when playing Policenauts for the first time was that the experience I waited 15 years to have would end far too quickly. I am happy to say that while Snatcher can take 6 hours to complete, Policenauts can be finished within a range of 8 to 11 hours, and while that can still be considered short, and replaying a film-styled game may not be something you would want to do again right away, the story is so engaging and rich with detail that sitting down and playing through this title every year or so would not be out of the question. There is no doubt that with the advances and changes with how people interact with the mouse, and with the added elements that games like Phoenix Wright have contributed to the adventure game platform, Policenauts could benefit from a full restoration, improving upon the video capabilities of the original PlayStation and advancing the point-and-click interactivity issues that can age this game to so many of today's players. In fact, all non-anime game artwork was originated in a high-resolution format and downscaled to fit the PlayStation's graphical limitations. This would lend itself easily to a new version of the game. The original images are also available for viewing in the Policenauts visual databook. We have looked at Policenauts as a story, a game, and the inevitable inspiration for future writers and game designers. As of late 2010, the Policenauts translation patch has garnered over 30,000 downloads from policenauts.net. This does not include the availability of the fully patched game through torrent sites and other web pages. Thanks to Marc Laidlaw, Artemio Urbina, Michael Sawyer, and a handful of other programmers and fans, Policenauts became one of the most successful and celebrated unofficial localizations in video gaming history. As we conclude our look at Policenauts, we were able to interview the men behind the localization project, getting a glimpse into the challenges, pitfalls, and successes of what has become one of the most ambitious and successful fan projects ever carried out by video game enthusiasts. From an appreciation of the Japanese language, combined with skills in programming, a group of individuals set out to not only translate, but also localize and even correct glitches in a classic game that had never been played by the English-speaking world. For the conclusion of Policenauts, a video game odyssey, we give you the story of why and how this game was reproduced and localized by a few fans of Hideo Kojima's work. We spoke with Michael Sawyer, one of the key programmers, as well as Artemio Urbina, the originator of this project.
For me, the thing that attracted me most to Policenauts as a narrative is the same thing as in Snatcher. It's the specific attention to detail and the creation of a world with so much background and background for the characters, and that don't necessarily contribute to the main plot, but give you the essence of a real-life world into which you are exploring.
I really like the dichotomy of old versus new that's explored in it, especially how Jonathan is kind of tied to the old world. You can especially see in symbolically in his cigarette, which has no place on the space colony, but how he won't give it up. And I know I guess it's sort of pervasive that way, and it's kind of this notion of as technology advances and we go further and further along that, it's I guess sort of a cautionary note.
In the year 2000, with a love for Kojima games, specifically Snatcher, in his native Mexico, Artemio Urbina began the process of delving into the elusive Policenauts. With a basic knowledge of the Japanese language and the ability to pull text from game ROMs, Artemio hoped to attract a potential translator to work on converting the Japanese story into English. It wasn't until he connected with another Snatcher enthusiast in a Metal Gear fan site did the beginnings of this odyssey coalesce. Someone who would give this game its due diligence in regard to preserving the Hideo Kojima voice and intentions, while maintaining the spirit of what is essentially a buddy cop movie with natural dialogue and interactions. Artemio met Marc Laidlaw, the individual who would become the main supervisor and driver of the localization efforts.
It was until Marc got on the project that that I had some real backup. So far, it was only the times that I had at the office or during the weekends that I tried just to hit the game and figure out the encoding. I did figure out encoding for Snatcher and for some other games before them, but Policenauts was a bit different.
Marc's attention to detail was pretty incredible and made me crazy at points. I think when we had our alpha, which was all text translated, he had a list of beta features, which I organized, which were, I think, numbered at about 86 things that he wanted changed, just as little one-off things.
He could tie in all the references to other Kojima games in an appropriate way, in ways that official translations usually can't, because the translator doesn't know the other games created by the same director, in this case Kojima.
Following the completion of this project, Marc had been the main interview focus for multiple gaming publications looking to learn more about the translation effort. While Marc has been an invaluable resource during the research and production steps of this retrospective, he decided to take a back seat during these interviews, leaving the discussion and the focus to Artemio and Michael. Policenauts not only required the addition of on-screen English subtitles for the spoken Japanese dialogue, but also the extensive text and menu systems needed translating as well. The intricacies of the Japanese language and the need to consider not only text, but also the intent, inflection, and tone behind the spoken phrases made Policenauts not simply a translation project, but also a more in-depth localization, much like the efforts taken in translating a novel for a different culture.
This was a localization versus a strict transliteration. And to that end, some of the more complicated concepts or emotional impact that the characters want to express, you can get that across by creatively interpreting that in your own words. And to that end, it wouldn't be a strict translation like word for word. So people who know some Japanese might notice here and there's a vocal disconnect with what's being said in the English subtitle. And it's definitely accurate, don't get me wrong. I mean, we wouldn't have spent so much time on this, if it were, it's just something we were going to make up. But a couple people, when the thing they like about unofficial translations is because they're not so heavily produced, you tend to get like the literal translation of what the person was talking about. But that makes it less palatable to audiences in general. So you have a trade-off where you say, because this is an unofficial project, we can write what we like, we can keep the original context in, as controversial as it may be. And then on the other hand, though, if you go too much to that route, then most English-speaking people who don't know anything about Japanese don't understand some of the cultural differences and concepts, so they don't understand what characters are particularly getting at. The way Marc put it was that localization is kind of a marriage between the translator and the original author. And in our case, we didn't have the original author to rely on, so we had to try to use the context as best we could to see what they were trying to convey in some of the dialogue.
Pulling game text from a Japanese game is a daunting task. Japanese characters are far more compact with the way they portray themes and words exhibited when comparing them to the goal of an English language counterpart. Hiragana and katakana, much like our own Roman alphabet, offer symbols that represent phonetic and syllabic sounds that are used to form words. This alone was one issue to overcome, but in the case of Policenauts, kanji was the larger issue, and the Policenauts translation team was not going to cut any corners.
The problem here was kanji. The game uses a very, very big set of kanji. If I remember correctly, it was like between 2,000 and 3,000 kanji. And the thing is that the kanji have a specific arrangement, just like A, B, C, D, E, F, G. You have that in English. It doesn't represent all the kanjis that are possible in Japanese. It just uses the ones that it will use in the game. Okay, just imagine, just for comparison, if you have a game in English and you didn't use the character B, let's say, just for comparison's sake, and you encode the game as A, C, D, E, F, G, and you try to decode that afterwards, it won't make sense because it's keeping the B, okay? The problem here is that we had to identify by hand each one of the kanjis that were and weren't used in the game based on the font set that a good friend, Cyber Warrior X, extracted from the Saturn version of the game, from the ROM, but we only have that specific font set as a graphic image, which each one of the kanjis has, I don't remember, was like 5 pixels wide by 6 pixels of height. So we had to, with that simple table, identify each one of the kanjis to have a relationship and then proceed with the text up.
Another added challenge to ROM hacking in general, but especially a game with a large text corpus like Policenauts, is different scenes actually all have the text encoded in different ways. So even if you crack the text dumping for one part, say the actual gameplay, it might be encoded differently. In the case of Policenauts, it was for the movie cutscenes, the voice-acted cutscenes, and then you have one-offs. The motorcycle scene in Act 2, which is only 12 lines of dialogue, is done entirely differently than the rest of the game. That alone took me a month, that one scene. And you have like little things like that. The devil's really in the details when it comes to ROM hacking projects, because there's always something that doesn't conform to the rest of it.
So you have to figure out how the game encodes the text, what is the specific set of characters it can represent, and figure out which segments of information in the game code are that specific data you're trying to figure out, and then convert them and interpret them as characters. But then another huge part comes in, that's bringing the text back to the game. The problem here is that Japanese is more compact in representing the ideas in terms of space, of bytes inside of the game code. So you have to most certainly expand the space that the game has. Of course, after that, you also have to deal with graphical changes, interface changes, and small details that keep coming and coming.
As work began, challenges arose throughout the process. Challenges that spanned the years that this project took to be completed. Programmers came and went, and years had gone by during the process. There was always the fear of being shut down by the powers that be, which led the group to making key moves throughout the project. Everything from registering the Policenauts.net website ahead of time in order to gauge sensitivities, or checking in on American copyrights associated to the game, and carefully gauging fan reaction in an effort to ensure that their pure fandom was not misconstrued or perceived as a threat by Konami.
I met Kojima in 2004, and I was really tempted to ask about the Policenauts translation and about the game, but of course I couldn't. There were some worries about Kojima Productions or Konami contacting us, but that was the main reason that we launched Policenauts.net. As you know, I bought the domains for Policenauts.com and Policenauts.net, and that was mainly for this project, but also as a way of testing waters, trying to figure out if there could be any action against us. So we launched the site without telling what we had so far. And of course, close to release, I was worried that they could shut us down. And that was the main reason that we decided to release on the date that we released. Of course, it was also Kojima's birthday, but it was on a death weekend for either USA or Japan. They didn't hold the copyright in the US. I checked every year to figure out if they tried to copyright it, and they didn't. So that was kind of also testing the waters. I was against disclosing that we were doing some advances. I always was in the position to have everything under curtains just because maybe they could stop us. So my main intention was always to have the project done and then released without further notice.
The issue too is the position that we're in, because it was unofficial, is they don't want to be seen as people, to have people encourage people to mod their games. And don't get me wrong, the translation project is not that, but to some people they don't see the difference. That also extends into the translation issue, because you are dealing with the dialogue of another company's intellectual property. So if you make them say something too offensive or too vulgar, then that could make people upset over it, Konami, because now you're making it seem like, oh well, the reason this game wasn't brought over is because the characters are too I don't know, they curse constantly or something like that, where it's too sexual in nature, let's say. You don't want to like imply something about the intellectual property, so you don't want to go too nuts with that.
They are between the wall and the sword, right? They can't just like attack us directly or attack a project like this because they get the fan base against them, and they can't support it because they simply can't manage it legally.
Along with these political concerns, more technical issues cropped up that had nothing to do with the translation issues. This had to do with the original game's programming. As the translation project continued to work, they discovered issues and glitches within the game program itself. While they could have continued to work, leaving these errors and problems just the way they had been originally made in the game, this team took the extra step of correcting the problems and the programming inconsistencies that they found.
The two big ones are in the museum scene with the mosquitoes flying around. If you load a save game, you'll actually crash the game, and I think this is actually on hardware too. On hardware, I believe it either crashes or it just slows down, but it becomes unplayable. And if you actually look, Konami tried to cover it up by removing the option to load the game in some areas, but they didn't actually do it all the way. So we had to actually complete that work and try to like circumvent that bug. It was a threading issue, which is really complicated at that low level of assembly programming. So we just had to complete their job of say like, okay, well they forgot to remove the load game option here, here, and here. Another big one is in the original Japanese game, in the motorcycle sequence, the last 4 lines when Ed is talking to Meryl go by really fast in the PlayStation version, almost unreadably so. So we had to figure out a way to slow that down to give the player some time to read that. There's a lot of background detail that you might not even notice that we changed in the scene when you first get to VCPD. Outside one of the mechs, the shadow appears, and there's a telot that says Beyond Coast Police Department. And they actually, in the original game, the shadow gets cut off by the subtitle. Like, for some reason, it just gets occluded and it doesn't look right. So we actually fixed that, which meant getting around the fact that Konami compressed the graphic in a proprietary format that we were unable to crack, but we were able to circumvent to put in our own compression algorithm in order to fit that graphic onto the disc, not take up any more space, and keep everything running smoothly. It was things like that really, really drove me nuts. But at the end of the day, I am pretty proud of that project. I hope that doesn't come off arrogant, but it is really cool that and that's because of Marc. There were a lot of times I was like, look, this is enough. People who want to play Policenauts can. Come on. And he's like, no, we gotta have, Gates Becker's little shadow here touched up, like things like that.
The project itself took many years to complete. Having lost one of their main programmers and his work was one of the larger hurdles that would only be jumped once Michael Sawyer came on board.
From the inception of the idea of trying to do the translation of the project till it was released, it was for around 9 years. It was just periods of work. Our main developer had to leave for personal reasons, so the project got stalled again. And the thing was that we couldn't get his work. We couldn't get his source code and what he had been working on. We just had what I had. So it was until we finally got the communication going and got that that code back that some work could be started again. But it was back and forth in these situations, and it was until Mike arrived that we got the pace again. This was all because that in reality my intention from the beginning was just doing the text dump. Of course, I was interested in doing several other things which I tried helping, which weren't much. I worked mainly on the credits and on some small details and support development code. But I was really interested and excited when Mike got on board. I tried to give whatever I could.
Policenauts is a testament to science fiction and the innovative uses of technology in order to tell a narrative. Along with the translation project and programming concerns, delving into the technology and the validity of that technology was another role taken on by the team.
Like the Metal Gear Solids, the technology involved is based on real-life, actual research. So, the O'Neill space cylinder and all the details mentioned in the game are factual to the O'Neill space station design. One of the beta testers was a space science, is going to school for space science actually, and in the translation notes, he included a little write-up about it, and he found it was very true to form even now, as the game is, even now as science has progressed, it's still pretty accurate.
Mark had to read a lot about space travel, about space stations. You don't know how much information he dug up into this just to correct some small details that were either wrong, and there was this huge problem about technical terms that were not properly written in Japanese, and he had to dive into those to figure out what was the correct term in English.
If you look at the scene with the Tokugawa Pharmaceuticals demo, when they talk about the other capsules and what's in them, there's, I think it's an indolin inhibitor and things like that. And he had to research, some pharmaceutical stuff too to make sure he got it all right. They're phonetically saying, indolin or, what have you. And you have to make sure that you're actually talking about the same thing to do an accurate translation.
Because Policenauts had never been available in English, it had the unique opportunity to not only receive reception based on the localization project, but on the gameplay as well. Policenauts, as it has been discussed already, is an acquired taste with a narrative that rewards patience and exploration at the expense of prolonged action sequences. And while the game has received mostly positive reception by Western audiences and reviewers, the translation effort has only received adoration and respect, as the community is completely aware of the effort taken in making this a reality.
The reception has been all positive mostly. It's very few that have small negative comments about language or specific words or specific situations, but in general it's been a very, very positive response.
With a unique story both behind the scenes and in the gameplay itself, Policenauts and the translation effort will forever be a highly regarded and respected entry into the history of gaming. As the years have passed, we can only imagine a future follow-up to Snatcher or Policenauts within a digital comic structure. But for those willing to take the time to experience this game from years past, they will have a story that they will remember for years to come. Policenauts is truly a video game odyssey.